Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Night Crew. Tonight's case takes us to the Soviet Union, where for years, children and young people began disappearing without explanation. Bodies would later be found in forests, along railway lines, and hidden in places where no one expected them. At the center of this nightmare was a man who looked completely normal. A teacher, a husband, a father. But behind that quiet exterior was one of the most horrifying serial killers. This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Rostov Ripper. If you're new here, this is a place where we dive deep into some of the darkest true crime cases from around the world. Stories that shock communities, haunt investigators, and leave questions that sometimes never get answered. And I want to start this episode by saying thank you, truly, to everyone who listens, supports, and keeps coming back week after week. Whether you've been here since the beginning or this is your very first episode, I appreciate you more than you know. Your support is what allows me to keep telling these stories and bringing attention to the victims behind them. So with that being said, let's begin. A childhood of hunger. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16th, 1936, in the rural village of Yablonchna, a small farming community in what is now modern-day Ukraine. But the world he was born into was already broken. During the early 1930s, just years before his death, the region had been devastated by a catastrophic famine known as the Holodomor. Millions of people died. Entire villages starved. Food became more valuable than money, and survival often came at the expense of morality. By the time Andrei was born, the trauma of that famine still lingered in the memories of villagers. Stories of starvation weren't history, they were personal memories. His parents were poor peasants. They lived in a small hut with little food and even fewer comforts. Meals were inconsistent, and hunger was a constant companion. Some reports suggest that as a child, Andrei suffered from chronic malnutrition, leaving him physically weak and frequently ill. Other children ran and played. Andrei struggled to keep up. The story of his brother. One of the most disturbing aspects of his childhood was a story told repeatedly within his household. It was about an older brother he had never met. According to family lore, Andrei's older sibling had been kidnapped during the famine, murdered, and eaten by starving neighbors. Cannibalism was rumored to have occurred during the famine, though historians later questioned whether the specific story was true or not. And for a young child, truth didn't matter. Belief did. Imagine growing up hearing that your own brother had been taken and eaten. That horror became part of Andrei's reality, part of his imagination, part of his fears. Some psychologists later theorized that this repeated story may have deeply affected his developing mind, creating early associations between hunger, violence, and survival. Whether the story was real or exaggerated, its psychological impact was undeniable. War arrives at his door. When World War II reached Soviet territory, Andrei was just a young boy. War didn't come quietly. It came with bombings, gunfire, and occupation. German forces eventually took control of the region surrounding Yablachna, bringing violence directly into the lives of civilians. Homes were destroyed, food was stolen, villagers were forced to live under constant threat. At one point during the occupation, Andrei's father was captured and taken prisoner by German forces. His mother was left alone to care for the family. According to historical accounts, his mother was reportedly assaulted by a German soldier, an event that deeply traumatized the household. Whether Andrei witnessed it or learned about it later, the emotional damage lingered. War taught him fear, but it also taught him helplessness. The bedwetting and humiliation. One of the most documented aspects of Andrei's childhood was his severe bedwetting, a problem that continued into late childhood. Today, that might be treated medically, but in rural Soviet life at the time, it was punished harshly. Some reports suggest his mother beat him for it. Others say he was publicly shamed, forced humiliation, constant embarrassment. Bedwetting in older children is often linked to stress, trauma, and fear, and Andrei lived surrounded by all three. Psychologists later believed this humiliation may have played a role in shaping his deep feeling of shame and resentment. Isolation and bullying. School should have been an escape for him, but for Andrei, it became another source of misery. He was described as thin, sickly, socially awkward, and easily bullied. Other children mocked him for his appearance and weakness. He struggled to make friends. He became withdrawn and quiet. Observers later described him as a child who preferred isolation over interaction, not because he wanted to be alone, but because he had been pushed there. Over time, isolation became his comfort zone, and resentment began to build. Academic intelligence and inner frustration. Despite his struggles, Andrei eventually showed strong academic abilities. He became a good student. Reading became his escape. Learning became his identity. But success in school didn't fix his emotional wounds. Instead, it created a dangerous imbalance. So externally, he appeared intelligent and capable. But internally, he felt humiliated, rejected, and powerless. Those conflicting identities would follow him into adulthood, and eventually, they would collide in horrifying ways. Puberty and sexual dysfunction. As Andrei entered adolescence, his body and mind were changing, but not in the ways he expected. He began to experience sexual dysfunction, struggling to perform normally. This became a source of embarrassment and shame, compounded by his history of humiliation and social isolation. Psychologists who later studied him noted that sexual arousal became linked to aggression for him. Instead of experiencing intimacy in healthy ways, Andrei's fantasies began to revolve around power, control, and violence. At the time, no one around him suspected the severity of his inner world. To neighbors and school authorities, he remained quiet, polite, and unremarkable. A facade that would allow him to operate undetected for years. During his teenage years, Andrei's social struggles continued. He was shy, awkward, and bullied. Bedwetting and previous humiliation had left lasting scars. He also began to fixate on victims in his environment, often watching young girls near school or public spaces. Some reports suggest he had early opportunities to act on violent impulses, but either fear or circumstances prevented him from doing so. It's clear, however, that by the time he reached adulthood, these urges had intensified. Marriage in the illusion of normalcy. In 1963, Andrei married Feodosa. On the surface, he was living a normal life as a husband, father, and a teacher. But behind closed doors, he struggled with sexual performance. He became increasingly frustrated with conventional intimacy, and he had fantasies of violence and sexual domination, which became more persistent. Some reports indicate he would practice his fantasies mentally, imagining attacks on vulnerable young women and children. Psychologists later noted that this was a dangerous rehearsal phase. His thoughts were evolving from fantasy into preparations for real action. Early signs of predatory behavior. Andrei's work as a teacher gave him access to children and teenagers, though no one realized the threat. Students later reported instances of inappropriate behavior. He sometimes displayed obsessive attention toward young girls, and he had a pattern of watching children in secluded areas. Although these early signs were concerning, Soviet authorities at the time often dismissed complaints. Bureaucratic oversight and a culture of denial allowed Andrei to continue flying under the radar. Psychological buildup before the first murder. By the late 1970s, Andrei's impulses had reached a critical point. His fantasies were intensely violent and sexualized, and he had access to victims, since they were easier to have access to them through public spaces like train stations, forests, and marketplaces. And impulses were building toward action. Then, in December 1978, he acted. The first victim, Elena, would be the first in a series of murders that would terrify the Soviet Union for over a decade. And by now, the audience understands this was not a random crime. Every step of his childhood and adolescence, famine, war, humiliation, isolation, sexual frustration, led to this moment. The first murder, Elena. December 22nd, 1978. It was a bitterly cold winter morning in Shakhty. The streets were quiet, frost clung to the roofs, and the villagers were still asleep. Elena, just 9 years old at the time, left her home to run a simple errand, to buy bread from the local store. No one noticed her leaving. No one suspected that the quiet, polite man they saw in the streets could ever be capable of evil. And that man was Andrei Chikatilo, luring the victim. Witnesses later described seeing Andrei speak calmly with Elena near the village path. He appeared friendly and trustworthy. He offered to walk her to the store. And no one suspected anything because he had a quiet, unassuming presence. But behind that polite facade, his mind was calculating and violent. At the time they reached a secluded area near a forest, Andrei's intentions were clear and terrifying. The attack. Andrei struck suddenly. Investigators later reconstructed the scene. Elena had no chance to resist. She was stabbed repeatedly in a frenzied attack. The wounds were focused on the torso and face, indicating both rage and ritualistic precision. According to forensic reports, the injuries were so severe that the victim's body showed multiple post-mortem mutilations, including tearing of clothing and soft tissue. Every strike reflected the violent, sexualized fantasies Andrei had been building since adolescence. Leaving the body. Once the attack was complete, Andrei didn't attempt to hide her body well. He left her near a riverbank in the forest. Her clothing was torn, and her small body bore the unmistakable signs of extreme violence. This act wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate. Investigators later noted that Andrei often returned to the site mentally after each killing, reliving the crime and reinforcing his fantasies for future victims. The discovery. Days later, villagers found Yelena's body. Shock spread quickly through the town. Parents began keeping children inside, and fear became a constant companion. Police investigated immediately, but in a tragic miscarriage of justice, they arrested an innocent man, Alexander Kravchenko. He was later convicted and executed for a crime that he did not commit, while the real killer continued to walk free. For Andrei, this murder was not the end. It was the beginning of a decade-long series of killings that would terrorize the Soviet Union. The escalation of the Rostov Ripper. After the murder of Yelena, Andrei didn't stop. Over the next several years, his killings became more frequent, more brutal, and more audacious. Even in a society with strict law enforcement, these murders continued undetected because Andrei appeared ordinary, polite, and harmless to everyone around him. The second known murder. In 1981, the second known victim, Larissa, a 17-year-old runaway, disappeared near a railroad station. Witnesses reported seeing a quiet, undistinguished man speaking with her, later identified as Andrei. Her body was discovered days later in a wooded area, showing horrific injuries, like repeated stabbing across the torso and neck, tearing of clothing and soft tissue suggesting post-mortem mutilation, and evidence of sexual assault, consistent with Andrei's fantasies. Investigators described the scene as unlike anything they had encountered before, marking the escalation of his violent behavior. By the early 1980s, the murder rate in Rostov and surrounding areas had increased dramatically. Some discoveries were particularly chilling, like bodies found in close proximity in forests, implying Andrei returned to the same hunting grounds. Victims strangled or stabbed multiple times, often after death, clothing torn, limbs sometimes displaced, and evidence of planned execution rather than random violence. Forensic experts later noted that Andrei repeatedly honed his attacks, improving his ability to murder and mutilate without leaving immediate evidence. Although many victims were killed, there were a few who escaped. These survivors later described Andrei as polite, calm, and soft-spoken, appearing trustworthy and ordinary, and approaching them with friendly offers of assistance. Forensic and psychological investigators noted that these near misses likely reinforced Andrei's confidence, teaching him how to avoid suspicion and strike without being caught. As the murders continued, public fear grew. Parents kept children inside. Streets near train stations and forests were deserted at night, and communities feared a monster living among them. Meanwhile, police struggled with early investigations, which were very disorganized. They had wrong suspects, like Alexander. Authorities were reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a serial killer, believing the idea conflicted with Soviet society. These failures allowed Andrei Chikatilo to continue unchecked, his killings becoming bolder and more frequent. The signature. By 1983 to 1984, Andrei's signature became unmistakable. He would lure victims near trains, marketplaces, or forests. He would overpower and stab them in frenzied attacks. And then there was the post-mortem mutilation, including dismemberment in some cases. He would leave bodies in partially visible areas, as if to terrorize the public. And he would occasionally return mentally or physically to relive the crime. This signature would eventually help investigators link the murders together, but only after more than a decade of terror. By the mid-1980s, Rostov and surrounding regions were gripped by terror. Children no longer walked to school alone, parents refused to let teenagers travel on trains, and townspeople whispered about a monster in the forest. Yet Andrei continued to blend in seamlessly. His ability to appear ordinary while committing such atrocities frustrated investigators and terrified the public. The Soviet authorities were slow to accept the reality of a serial killer. Early investigations were fragmented and uncoordinated. Police often dismissed links between cases, believing serial killings were a Western problem. Andrei used these failures to learn from the investigators. He adapted his methods, became more careful, and refined his attacks. Even when detained briefly for questioning, he avoided incriminating himself and was released. By the late 1980s, his killing patterns were undeniable. Psychologists brought in to assist investigators described the killer as intelligent, a manipulator, emotionally cold, and capable of blending into society while harboring extreme violence. This profile matched Andrei perfectly, but Soviet investigative techniques at the time were still catching up to modern profiling methods. The turning point came when authorities began linking physical evidence from multiple crime scenes. Blood group analysis revealed consistent patterns across several murders. Witnesses provided detailed descriptions of a man seen with multiple victims. Investigators noted Andrei's reliance on public transportation and train stations, which became a key part of surveillance. Despite these breakthroughs, catching him proved difficult. He changed jobs and moved locations temporarily. He studied their investigative methods, avoiding prior mistakes. Survivors who escaped, often traumatized, were initially dismissed or misremembered details due to fear. By 1990, after more than a decade of terror, the authorities were finally closing in. A manhunt was organized across multiple regions. Train stations were monitored. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to match blood evidence to victims. In November 1990, after years of evading capture, Andrei finally made a critical error. He was observed attempting to lure a young girl near a train station. The girl escaped unharmed. She immediately alerted authorities, giving a detailed description of the man. Investigators now had a face to match the decade-long trail of murders. Andrei was detained shortly afterward. During the arrest, witnesses noted he appeared calm, polite, and almost relieved. No violent resistance. His confidence seemed unshaken. Authorities immediately recognized him as a suspect in multiple unsolved murders. Once in custody, Andrei began confessing to crimes spanning more than a decade. Some of the details he revealed were very, very gruesome. Investigators later noted that the brutality escalated over time, and his confessions matched forensic evidence with uncanny precision. He confessed to 52 confirmed murders, though some experts believe the number could have been higher. During trial proceedings and psychiatric evaluations, experts described him as highly intelligent and a manipulator, obviously. He displayed no remorse for his victims. His childhood trauma, starvation, war, Isolation combined with sexual dysfunction had created a perfect storm for extreme violent behavior. In court, he reportedly calmly recounted his crimes, sometimes smiling when describing the attacks. Psychologists concluded Andrei's violence was both sexual and ritualistic. His murders were carefully planned yet carried out in a frenzied state, reflecting the merging of fantasy and reality in his mind. Andrei's trial from 1992 to 1994 was a national sensation. Media coverage was extensive, though heavily controlled. Survivors and families of victims testified, providing heartbreaking accounts. Forensic experts detailed the horrific nature of the murders, shocking the courtroom. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions, survivor testimony, and forensic matches across multiple murder sites. Defense psychologists argued mental illness, but the court found him legally sane and responsible for his actions. In 1994, after more than a decade of terror, Andrei was convicted of 52 murders. He was sentenced to death, and he was executed by gunshot later that year. Even in death, his story left a lasting mark on criminal psychology. How trauma, social isolation, and untreated psychological issues can manifest into extreme violence. How systematic investigative failures allowed a monster to remain free for years. And how one man could terrorize a nation while hiding behind a mask of normalcy. The story of Andrei is more than a tale of murder. It's a story about trauma and isolation, how unchecked impulses can escalate over time, the consequences of investigative failure, and the chilling truth that someone who appears ordinary and unassuming can hide unimaginable darkness. For over a decade, Andrei terrorized families, communities, and authorities, leaving behind a trail of fear and grief that can never be erased. As we close tonight, I want to leave you with this. Evil often lurks in the shadows of normalcy, and sometimes it is only through understanding and attention to warning signs that it can be stopped. The victims of Andrei's crimes, the children and young women whose lives were stolen, deserve to be remembered, not just as numbers, but as real people with hopes, families, and futures. While the Rostov Ripper is gone, his story serves as a dark reminder of human nature, psychology, and the importance of justice. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Night Crew. If you found tonight's story compelling or chilling, consider sharing the podcast with others who love true crime, and make sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss the next story. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the world can be dark, but understanding that darkness is one way to face it.